The night my family kicked me out, my sister cried like the perfect victim, blaming me for her ruined marriage. My parents did not ask a single question before slamming the door in my face. 7 days later, in a cramped rental, a cold email from Rivermark Title and Escrow arrived. 10 minutes after opening the attachment, my phone blew up with frantic calls. They did not miss me. They just realized the truth finally had paperwork. My name is Natalie Bennett. I am 34 years old, and on a Tuesday evening in mid-October, I became the villain of my own family. It happened right on the manicured front lawn of the house I grew up in. The air was crisp, the kind of quiet suburban evening where people usually walked their dogs or watered their gardens. But tonight, the street served as an auditorium for my public execution, and the first thing to shatter was not a picture frame or a dining room plate, but the foolish belief that my own flesh and blood would ever care to hear my side of the story. Amelia Bennett Price, my older sister, stood under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the porch light. Her face was streaked with tears that caught the illumination just perfectly. Her posture folded inward like a delicate bird struck by a stone. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest. "You poured poison into his head," Amelia sobbed, her voice loud enough to echo down the block and bounce off the neighboring houses. "You ruined my marriage, Natalie. You ruined everything I have built." She was talking about her husband, Grant Price. I stood frozen on the concrete walkway, my keys digging into the palm of my hand. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline of a terrible joke, but Amelia did not pause to let me process the accusation. She launched into a story so intricately woven and intensely delivered that I almost marveled at the craftsmanship. Amelia told our parents that I had been secretly meeting with Grant for months. She claimed I had driven him to a high-profile divorce strategist in the city, sitting in a sleek office that cost $500 an hour, plotting her financial ruin. According to her, I sat in that leather chair and actively encouraged Grant to hire private investigators. I had allegedly urged him to comb through her life, her bank accounts, and her daily routines, telling him he was a fool to trust his own wife. She told him I was hiding things. Amelia wept, clutching our mother's arm as if she might collapse without the physical support. She fed him lies until he could not even look at me anymore. She orchestrated the entire thing. I looked at our mother, Diane Bennett. I waited for the natural maternal pause. I waited for the moment where she would look at her younger daughter, the daughter who had never shown an ounce of malice toward her sister, and ask if this insane narrative was actually true. That pause never came. Diane immediately wrapped her arms tightly around Amelia, pulling her close, glaring at me over Amelia's shaking shoulders. Her eyes were hard and completely shut off to me. In my mother's eyes, Amelia had always been the masterpiece. Amelia was the successful one, the polished one, the daughter who knew exactly how to behave, how to dress, and how to project the image of absolute perfection. Amelia was a vice president at an esteemed firm, married to a handsome man, living in a sprawling house. I was just the quiet, solitary compliance analyst. I was the background noise. Diane believed her without a shadow of a doubt because believing Amelia meant protecting the family's crown jewel. Then came my father. Paul Bennett marched out the front door, the heavy oak slamming shut behind him with a sound like a gunshot. His face was a dark, terrifying shade of red, the veins in his neck bulging against his collar. He did not step forward to ask me for an explanation. Evidence was entirely irrelevant when his golden child was weeping on the front porch. "I always knew you were jealous," my father spat, his voice trembling with a rage that seemed to have been boiling beneath the surface for decades. He stopped a few feet away from me, his fists clenched at his sides. "I knew it. You have always envied the perfect life your sister built. You could never stand to see her happy because you have nothing of your own, so you decided to burn her house down. You decided to destroy her to make yourself feel better." "Dad, I did not do any of that," I said. My voice was eerily calm, though my chest felt as if it were caving in under immense pressure. "I have not spoken to Grant in over 2 months. I do not even know what a divorce strategist is." My defense fell on deaf ears. The truth had no currency here. My father turned on his heel, stormed back into the house, and returned exactly 2 minutes later. I had been staying in my old childhood bedroom for precisely 3 weeks, while my apartment lease transitioned, my life neatly packed into a few bags and boxes. My father did not carry my belongings down the stairs with any shred of dignity. He shoved them. My heavy black suitcase tumbled down the concrete steps, scraping the fabric, landing violently in the dirt next to the hydrangea bushes. The large cardboard box filled with my books followed. It hit the pavement and burst open on the walkway. Hardcovers and paperbacks spilled across the damp grass, their pages fluttering in the cold wind. Porch lights began to flicker on across the street. I could see the silhouette of Mr. Henderson standing behind his screen door, watching the spectacle. The humiliation burned through my veins, hotter and more suffocating than anger. It was a visceral, physical weight pressing down on my shoulders, pinning my feet to the ground. Amelia buried her face in our mother's neck. "Natalie always wanted to destroy what I have," she whimpered, her voice breaking on the exact right syllable. Looking at her, watching the theatrical perfection of her breakdown, a chilling realization washed over my panicked mind. This was not a hysterical, impulsive outburst. This was a calculated strategy. Amelia had prepared this story well in advance. It was compact, meticulously detailed, and entirely believable to parents who already favored her. Above all, it was convenient. It gave the family an immediate scapegoat. The family could easily swallow the idea of a bitter, jealous younger sister maliciously destroying a marriage, rather than confronting whatever ugly, complicated truth was actually unraveling the bond between Amelia and Grant. Amelia needed a villain, and she had cast me in the role. I did not scream. I did not fall to my knees and beg them to look at me, to really look at me and see that I was innocent. The sheer, towering injustice of the moment paralyzed my vocal cords, but it also hardened something deep inside my chest. A cold, impenetrable shield formed around my heart. I walked forward in absolute silence. I crouched on the damp lawn and began gathering my books one by one. I picked up a worn copy of a novel my father had given me for my 16th birthday. The irony was suffocating. I wiped a smear of mud from the cover and placed it gently into the broken cardboard box. My hands were shaking violently, but I forced my breathing to remain slow and steady. I did not shed a single tear for them to see. The grief had bypassed my eyes and settled directly into my bones. I was a compliance analyst. My entire career was built on observing discrepancies, auditing files, and noticing the tiny cracks in a facade that everyone else ignored. Right now, the discrepancy was glaring. Innocent people who are suddenly betrayed demand answers. They ask questions. They want to know the mechanics of the betrayal. My family was not asking a single question. They did not want the truth. They just wanted a target to absorb the shock of Amelia's failing life. I packed the broken box, lifted it against my chest, and carried it to my 10-year-old sedan parked on the street. I walked back for the suitcase, dragging it out of the dirt and pulling it across the concrete. I threw my belongings into the trunk, the heavy thud echoing loudly against the quiet suburban houses. As I walked around to the driver's side, I looked back one last time. The front door remained wide open. My parents and my sister stood on the porch, clustered together beneath the warm yellow light. They looked like a unified front, a flawless fortress that had successfully expelled a toxic invader. They looked like a family that had just amputated a diseased limb and felt nothing but relief. I opened my car door. Before I could slide into the driver's seat, my father stepped forward to the very edge of the porch. He distanced himself from the warmth of the house, looking at me as if I were a stranger who had just vandalized his property. His voice boomed across the yard, slicing through the quiet autumn night, delivering a sentence that would become the deepest, most permanent wound of my entire life. "Do not bother calling us," he yelled, his tone dripping with a cold disgust that made my stomach turn over. "You no longer deserve to belong to this family." I got into the car, put the engine in drive, and pulled away from the curb, leaving the only family I had ever known standing in the rearview mirror. utterly convinced they had just cut out the cancer. The space I found was a converted studio apartment sitting heavy above a detached, rotting garage in South St. Louis. The rent was $850 a month, paid to an absentee landlord who only communicated via brief text messages and never bothered to fix the drafts whistling through the window frames. It was suffocatingly cramped. If I stood in the dead center of the room and stretched my arms out, I could nearly touch the edge of the cheap twin mattress and the greasy laminate of the kitchen counter at the exact same time. The baseboard heaters did nothing but emit a faint, burning dust smell, leaving the air inside perpetually cold. At midnight, the silence of the residential neighborhood was so absolute that I could hear the copper water pipes rattling violently inside the thin walls whenever the main house flushed a toilet or ran a faucet. Yet, as I sat on the scuffed hardwood floor unpacking my taped-up boxes and staring at the peeling yellow paint on the ceiling, a strange, profound sense of relief washed over my exhausted body. For the first time in my adult life, I was standing inside a perimeter that belonged entirely to me. There was no pristine mahogany dining table to accidentally scratch. There was no beautifully decorated guest room I was merely occupying as a favor until I got my feet on the ground. Most importantly, there was absolutely no one who could walk through the flimsy wooden door and suddenly decide I no longer belonged there. The physical isolation was brutal, but the emotional safety of that ugly little room was mine. During the day, I retreated into the sterile, predictable world of my job. I worked as a compliance analyst for the Lakeview Corridor Renewal Office. It was a municipal oversight agency, which sounded far more glamorous to outsiders than it actually was. My entire professional existence revolved around digging through towering stacks of urban development proposals, cross-referencing commercial real estate deeds, and hunting down contractual discrepancies. While other people looked at a newly constructed community center or a revitalized downtown block and saw progress, I saw a massive labyrinth of audit logs and liability clauses. I spent 40 hours a week looking at the tiny details that ordinary people completely glossed over. I looked at the timestamps on digital signatures. I tracked wire transfers down to the exact cent. I noticed when a contractor filed a permit on a Tuesday, but the corresponding environmental clearance was not approved until a Thursday 2 weeks later. My brain was systematically hardwired to find the error in the sequence. I spent my days catching people who tried to hide hundreds of thousands of dollars behind shell corporations or forged inspection dates. In the world of compliance, numbers and dates do not lie, and they certainly do not cry on front porches to gain unearned sympathy. On the fifth night in the studio, the steep wooden stairs outside my door groaned under a set of heavy, determined footsteps. A sharp, rapid knocking followed. I opened the door to find Tessa McCall standing on the landing, clutching 2 grease-stained brown paper bags from a local Thai restaurant. Tessa was a senior paralegal at a cutthroat downtown litigation firm. She possessed a sharp tongue, absolutely zero patience for social pleasantries, and a fierce, terrifying loyalty that made her the best friend I could ever hope to have. "I brought pad thai and enough anger to burn down a small, wealthy suburb," Tessa announced, pushing past me into the freezing room without waiting for an invitation. She dumped the bags onto the small folding table I was using as a makeshift desk and immediately began pulling out plastic containers. She did not offer me pity. She did not look at my swollen eyes or comment on the pathetic, barren state of my living quarters. She just handed me a plastic fork, dragged the only desk chair over, and motioned for me to sit on the edge of my mattress. I had told her the entire story over the phone the morning after the eviction. My voice had been flat and completely devoid of emotion as I recounted the humiliation on the lawn. Now, eating cold noodles in the dim light of a single desk lamp, Tessa began to cross-examine the situation with the surgical precision of someone who dealt with professional liars for a living. "A story that airtight does not just fall out of the sky," Tessa said, pointing her plastic fork directly at my chest. "Think about it. Natalie, she had the exact timeline of your supposed interference. She had the perfect motive handed to them on a silver platter, which was your lifelong jealousy. She had the location, claiming you took him to a high-end strategist's office. People who are genuinely blindsided by a failing marriage do not have a perfectly constructed 3-act screenplay ready to perform in the front yard. They are usually too busy hyperventilating and checking their spouse's text messages to invent a complex villain. I stared down at my food, suddenly losing my appetite. The gaslighting I had endured was so severe that my own memory had begun to feel like a hostile witness. The trauma of being discarded so easily by my parents had severely warped my sense of reality. "What if I did say something, though?" I whispered, my voice trembling in the quiet room. What if I made a stray comment at Thanksgiving about Grant looking stressed? What if I accidentally forwarded an email a year ago that she misconstrued? Maybe I unconsciously gave Grant the impression that I was on his side against her. Maybe she actually believes I did this. Maybe I am somehow at fault. Tessa slammed her plastic container down onto the folding table. The sharp crack echoed loudly in the small room, instantly silencing my downward spiral of self-doubt. She leaned forward, her dark eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that demanded absolute focus. "Stop doing their job for them," Tessa snapped, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Stop cross-examining yourself to protect a sister who threw you to the wolves. Do not ask who cries better. Ask who needs a story before the truth appears." The words hung in the freezing air of the studio, cutting through the thick fog of my grief like a high-powered beam of light. I stopped chewing. I carefully placed my fork down on the table. For the first time since I packed my boxes in the dirt, my mind stopped playing a loop of my father shouting at me. The terrified, heartbroken daughter who had been unceremoniously thrown into the street suddenly stepped aside. The compliance analyst took the wheel. Tessa was absolutely right. Amelia was brilliant, but she was also incredibly vain and obsessed with public optics. She would never willingly blow up her own flawless reputation, risk a messy, public divorce, and alienate her wealthy husband unless she was desperately scrambling to cover up something much worse. She needed to strike first. She needed to control the narrative before the narrative controlled her. By turning me into the malicious architect of her marital destruction, she had successfully diverted everyone's attention. My parents were so busy being furious at me that they were completely ignoring whatever massive structural damage was actually causing the foundation of Amelia's perfect life to cave in. Sitting in that miserable, drafty room above a stranger's garage, the biting temperature no longer bothered me. The crushing weight of the injustice did not magically vanish, but it finally crystallized into something incredibly sharp, cold, and highly focused. I was done wondering why my family did not love me enough to believe my innocence. From that exact moment forward, I was going to treat my own family like a Lakeview corridor audit file. I was going to look at the discrepancies. I was going to follow the paper trail, and I was going to find the missing timestamp. Tessa dragged her yellow legal pad across my flimsy folding table, her pen tapping a sharp, rhythmic beat against the cardboard backing. She ordered me to stop replaying the shouting match on the lawn. The eviction was merely the finale of my sister's perfectly orchestrated play, Tessa explained, and analyzing the curtain call would not tell us how she built the stage. We needed to rewind the clock. We needed to go back 3 or 4 months, long before anyone in my family had ever uttered the word divorce. I closed my eyes, leaning my head against the cold plaster wall of the studio, and forced my exhausted brain to sift through the mundane interactions of the past summer. I stripped away the familiar, comforting filter of sibling trust. When I looked at Amelia's behavior through the sterile, unforgiving lens of a compliance audit, the anomalies immediately began to blink bright red. She had been unusually paranoid. Sometime around late July, Amelia started calling me during my strictly timed lunch breaks, her tone artificially light and conversational. She would casually ask if Grant had reached out to me, fishing to see if we had engaged in any private text messages or phone calls. She wanted to know if he had mentioned his stress levels, his daily work schedule, or more specifically, their shared banking alerts. At the time, I had assumed she was just an anxious wife worried about her husband's demanding corporate job. I had assured her we rarely spoke. Then, the most glaring red flag of all materialized in my memory, hitting me so hard my breath hitched. Several times over the late summer, Amelia had invited me over for Sunday brunch. Amidst the mimosas and expensive pastries, she would slide thick, intimidating real estate documents across the marble kitchen island. She claimed she was just trying to understand the dense legal jargon for her high-end home staging company, Evergrove Home Studio. She asked me to explain the mechanics of escrow accounts, the required signatures for property title transfers, and exactly how long a wire transfer took to clear out of a joint checking account without triggering a massive fraud alert from the bank. I had laughed and translated the legalese for her, completely oblivious to the fact that I was providing free consulting for my own framing. Her job involved picking out imported velvet sofas and hanging abstract art, not navigating the strict regulatory compliance of property ownership. She was doing research, Tessa said, circling a large, heavy word on her yellow pad. She was figuring out how to move major assets, and she was using your exact professional expertise to do it securely. If Amelia was hiding something massive and financial, she had to be doing it during her working hours. We needed an insider. We needed someone who saw Amelia when she was not carefully managing her perfect family persona for our mother. That logic led us directly to Ivy Calder. Ivy was Amelia's former administrative assistant at Evergrove Home Studio. She had quit abruptly just 2 weeks before the grand blow-up on my parents' lawn. Tessa utilized her firm's investigative databases to track her down, and after 45 minutes of relentless, carefully worded text messages, Tessa convinced Ivy to meet us at a dimly lit, overpriced cocktail lounge downtown on a rainy Thursday night. Ivy arrived looking entirely exhausted, clutching a massive leather tote bag to her chest like a defensive shield. She slid into the circular velvet booth across from us, nervously chewing on the plastic straw of her club soda. Initially, she was highly defensive. She spoke in vague, carefully constructed circles, terrified of violating some imaginary non-disclosure agreement or invoking Amelia's legendary wrath. Tessa did not have the patience for corporate loyalty. She leaned across the sticky mahogany table, fixing Ivy with a predatory, unblinking stare. Tessa explained, in graphic and highly intimidating legal terms, that withholding information regarding potentially fraudulent marital asset diversion could easily make her look like an active accomplice if things ever went to a messy civil court. It was a massive, highly unethical bluff on Tessa's part, but it worked beautifully. Ivy dropped the shield. The floodgates opened, and the polished, magazine-ready image of Amelia's successful business shattered into a million ugly pieces right there in the booth. She was losing her absolute mind, Ivy whispered, leaning in so close I could smell the sharp citrus of her expensive perfume. Starting about 6 weeks ago, Amelia became completely unhinged. She was locking her office door in the middle of the afternoon. She was shredding documents by the pound. Grant had started asking serious questions about the money. According to Ivy, Grant had noticed several large, completely unexplained wire transfers draining from their joint savings account. Whenever he asked for a simple, logical explanation, Amelia would launch into aggressive, tearful tirades, accusing him of suffocating her business independence and financially abusing her. But she was terrified, Ivy continued, her eyes darting around the dark lounge as if Amelia might materialize from the shadows by the bar. She was pacing the showroom floors, constantly muttering about needing to stay one step ahead of him. She was obsessed with the idea that Grant was going to hire a forensic accountant to audit the staging company. She made me create encrypted digital folders for her private correspondence. She knew the walls were closing in on her. Tessa tapped her fingernail sharply against her glass. What was she spending the money on, Ivy? Home staging does not require secret offshore accounts or encrypted files. Ivy took a long, shaky breath, hesitating for a fraction of a second before dropping a name that fundamentally altered the entire trajectory of my understanding. It was not about furniture, Ivy said softly, her voice barely audible over the jazz music playing in the background. It was about Nolan Reeves. The name hit the table like a lead weight. Nolan Reeves was a prominent, highly aggressive commercial real estate developer who practically owned half the newly gentrified districts in the city. He was also very publicly married to a prominent local socialite. He and Amelia frequently collaborated on massive, high-budget staging projects for his luxury penthouses. They were always together, Ivy explained, her voice dropping another octave. And it was not just professional. There was this heavy, suffocating energy whenever he walked into the studio. They would stand far too close. They would whisper in the narrow hallway near the break room, but the exact second anyone else walked in, they would snap apart and start talking loudly about throw pillows and modern lighting fixtures. They always stopped just in time. They were careful enough that no outsider could ever prove anything definitively, but everyone in the office knew. You could literally feel the guilt in the air. I sat back against the velvet cushion, the loud thumping bass of the lounge music fading into a dull, distant hum inside my head. The scattered, chaotic puzzle pieces of the last 3 months suddenly snapped together with a violent, sickening clarity. Amelia did not invent this elaborate lie because she actually thought I was a threat to her marriage. She did not throw me to the wolves out of some petty, lingering childhood rivalry or simple jealousy. She did it out of sheer, absolute panic. Grant was getting too close to the missing money. If Grant kept digging into the bank statements, he would inevitably find the financial trail. If he found the money, he would find the assets. If he found the assets, he would find Nolan Reeves. If the affair and the embezzlement were exposed, Amelia would lose her wealthy husband, her pristine professional reputation, and the unwavering, cult-like worship of our parents all in one catastrophic afternoon. She needed a massive, blazing distraction. She needed a fire so large and so emotionally consuming that Grant would completely abandon his financial investigation to focus on the betrayal of his own family circle. She needed a villain to take the fall, and she had coldly, systematically chosen her own flesh and blood. I looked at Tessa, who was already writing Nolan's name in thick, aggressive capital letters on her legal pad. The paralyzing confusion that had choked me since the night of my eviction evaporated, replaced by a cold, terrifying sense of absolute purpose. I was no longer a discarded sibling crying over a lost family. I was a compliance analyst staring at a massive, deliberate fraud, and I finally knew exactly where to start digging. It took me 45 minutes to draft a text message consisting of exactly 22 words. I stared at Grant's name in my contact list, my thumb hovering over the send button while my pulse hammered against my ribs. Based on the spectacular theatrical performance Amelia had delivered on the front lawn, I fully expected my brother-in-law to hate me. I assumed she had thoroughly poisoned him against me, painting me as the bitter architect of his marital collapse. I braced myself for ignored messages or a vicious, expletive-laden rejection. Instead, my phone buzzed with a reply in less than 2 minutes. He agreed to meet immediately. The location he chose was a remarkably quiet, independent coffee shop tucked away on a dreary commercial block, far from the polished, upscale neighborhoods my family frequented. I arrived 15 minutes early and secured a small wooden table in the back corner. When Grant walked through the glass door, I actually gripped the edge of the table, ready for a tense confrontation. The man who sat down across from me was not an angry, vengeful husband. He looked like a hollowed-out shell. The sharp, confident posture I had always associated with a successful corporate director was completely gone. His eyes were heavily bloodshot, underscored by deep, bruised shadows, and his tailored coat hung loosely on his frame. He looked precisely like a man who had been subjected to severe, relentless psychological manipulation for months on end. He did not bother with pleasantries. He did not order a drink. He just folded his hands on the scratched wooden surface and looked at me with an expression of sheer, unadulterated exhaustion. "You and I both know you never took me to a divorce lawyer," Grant said, his voice flat and perfectly level. "You never encouraged me to hire a private investigator. You never introduced me to another woman. The entire story is a complete fabrication." Hearing the absolute certainty in his voice felt like a physical weight lifting off my chest, but the relief was instantly crushed by the terrifying reality of what his statement actually meant. If Grant was not buying the narrative, then Amelia had not just lied to our parents. She had lied to the entire world while the actual victim of her deception sat directly across from me. "Then why did she say it?" I asked, keeping my tone as controlled as his. Why did she burn me at the stake in front of our parents if you already knew it was a lie? Grant let out a bitter, humorless laugh that sounded more like a cough. Because she needed a smokescreen, Natalie. She needed our parents to look away from the actual fire. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a single, neatly folded sheet of paper. He slid it across the table. It was a printed bank statement, heavily redacted with thick black marker, leaving only a few specific lines visible. 6 weeks ago, I found a massive discrepancy in our finances, Grant explained, his finger tapping against a highlighted row. We have a home equity line of credit that we rarely touch. I discovered it was nearly maxed out. We are talking about tens of thousands of dollars withdrawn in a very short window of time. The money was not used for our mortgage. It was not used for repairs, and it certainly was not funneled into her staging business. The funds simply vanished. I stared at the staggering withdrawal amounts printed on the page. The compliance analyst inside my brain immediately calculating the severity of the financial diversion. This was not a misplaced credit card bill. This was methodical, calculated extraction. Every single time I confronted her about the missing money, the conversation instantly derailed. Grant continued, leaning closer, the exhaustion in his voice giving way to a cold, hard anger. She would completely ignore the bank statements. She would start screaming that I was financially abusing her, that I was suffocating her independence, and then, without fail, she would pivot to you. She claimed I was only auditing her because you were putting ideas into my head. She weaponized your name every time I got too close to the money. The sheer malice of the tactic left me speechless. Amelia had not just used me as a convenient scapegoat. She had actively utilized my professional background to make her lie bulletproof. She knew that as a compliance analyst, I was the most logical person to suspect of coaching someone through a financial investigation. There is something else, Grant said, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied my face. Over the last month, she became strangely obsessed with your specific skill set. She kept casually asking me if I thought you knew how to bypass standard real estate portals. She asked if you regularly dealt with escrow accounts, closing packets, or property transfer emails in your daily work. She wanted to know exactly how deep your access went. A cold chill crawled up the back of my neck. She asked you if I could read property transfer emails? Grant nodded slowly. Yes, she was terrified of something slipping through the cracks. As her husband, I watched her unravel. About 2 weeks ago, we were in the kitchen. We share an electronic tablet for recipes and calendar syncs. A push notification suddenly popped up on the locked screen. Amelia practically lunged across the marble island. She snatched the tablet and swiped the notification away so violently she nearly dropped the device. She deleted whatever it was before I could demand to see it. Did you see anything at all? I pressed, my heart rate accelerating. Grant closed his eyes, pinching the bridge of his nose as he fought to recall the fleeting image. I only caught the banner logo at the top before it vanished. It was not a bank. It was from a place called the Marlowe Residence Club. Do you know it? The name hit my ears, and the entire noisy ambiance of the coffee shop ceased to exist. The grinding of the espresso machine, the murmur of the barista, the traffic outside the window all vanished, replaced by a deafening, terrifying silence inside my own head. I knew the Marlowe Residence Club. It was a highly exclusive, ultra-luxury condominium complex downtown that also featured premium event spaces on its lower levels. But I did not know it because I socialized there. I knew it because exactly 14 months ago, the Lakeview Corridor Renewal Office had hosted a massive urban revitalization fair in their grand ballroom. I had been the primary compliance officer assigned to that specific event. During the chaotic weeks leading up to the fair, we had to coordinate with dozens of external vendors, catering companies, and structural inspectors. The administrative portal Marlowe used for their property management and event coordination was notoriously rigid, requiring strict two-factor authentication for every single guest account. To save hours of tedious bureaucratic delays, I had created a secondary temporary administrative profile within their system. I had used my own professional work email address as the designated catch-all for vendor confirmations, closing schedules, and parking validations. It was a minor procedural shortcut. It was a tiny, insignificant administrative detail that I had completely forgotten about the moment the urban renewal fair ended. I had never deactivated the secondary profile because it was only supposed to be linked to the ballroom rental tier. But if Amelia had somehow gained access to that system, if she had bought property or signed a lease in that building, her information would be processed through the exact same master portal. I looked down at my shaking hands, the horrifying truth settling over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Amelia had not just diverted tens of thousands of dollars. She had not just engaged in an affair with a prominent real estate developer. She had actively acquired a physical property. And in her desperate, frantic attempt to hide the digital paper trail from her husband, she had realized there was a fatal flaw in her plan. She realized that any automated administrative notification, any closing document, or any accidental system alert from the Marlowe Residence Club might be forcefully routed to the secondary compliance profile that still existed in their database. She realized the documents might be routed directly to me. That was why she had to destroy me. She had to ensure that if I ever received a strange, misdirected email containing her financial secrets, our parents would never believe a single word I said. She had preemptively burned my credibility to ash, so that when the digital evidence finally arrived, I would simply look like a jealous, vindictive sister trying to frame her. It was not a family dispute. It was a calculated, preemptive strike against the only person who possessed the administrative access to ruin her. "Grant," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, mechanical whisper. "I need to go back to my office. Right now." I sat at my cramped desk at the Lakeview Corridor Renewal Office, the glow of my dual monitors reflecting off the dark window panes. The city outside was quiet, but my mind was operating at maximum capacity. I had spent the last 48 hours mapping out the architecture of my sister's deception, and the sheer scale of it was breathtaking. Amelia had not merely panicked and pointed a finger at me. She had systematically constructed my motive long before the night on the front lawn. Looking back at the family dinners over the late summer, I realized she had been carefully planting seeds. She would make offhand comments to our father about how I seemed bitter, how my studio apartment was depressing compared to her estate, how I always looked at Grant with a strange sense of longing. She was preloading the jury. When the time came to pull the trigger, our parents already had a loaded gun of justification waiting in their hands. Tessa marched into my office at exactly 8:30 in the morning, holding 2 large coffees and a thick manila folder. She bypassed the visitor chair and spread glossy magazine printouts directly across my keyboard. She had spent her entire weekend cross-referencing local business journals, charity gala registries, and society pages. "Look at the dates," Tessa commanded, tapping a French manicured nail against a photograph of Amelia smiling brightly next to Nolan Reeves at a waterfront fundraiser. Over the past 4 months, Amelia attended 16 different high-profile real estate events. Nolan Reeves was a keynote speaker, a platinum sponsor, or a guest of honor at every single one of them. She told your parents she was aggressively expanding her commercial staging division. She was actually just shadowing her married boyfriend in broad daylight, using professional networking as her bulletproof alibi. My phone vibrated against the desk. It was an encrypted file transfer from Grant. He had finally managed to gain access to the deepest layers of their shared financial archives and sent over the remaining bank statements. I opened the document, my eyes immediately locking onto a specific column of numbers. On the 14th of September, exactly 1 week before Amelia started complaining to our mother about my supposed interference, a catastrophic amount of money had evaporated from their joint investment account. It was not a slow bleed. It was a massive surgical extraction of $150,000, routed through a complex series of holding companies. The timeline was entirely flawless. The exact moment the money disappeared, my sister aggressively escalated her campaign to turn me into the ultimate family villain. But there was a second, far more disturbing revelation hidden within the documents Grant provided. Tucked beneath the massive withdrawal was a record of an incoming wire transfer dated the 2nd of October. The amount was $75,000. The sender was listed under a private wealth management trust. I recognized the routing number instantly. It belonged to an independent account our mother, Diane, had inherited from my grandfather years ago. I stared at the screen, a cold, heavy knot forming in the pit of my stomach. My mother had secretly loaned Amelia a small fortune. She told Mom it was an emergency bridge loan for the business, I whispered, the sickening reality washing over me. She must have claimed the staging company was experiencing a temporary cash flow issue due to delayed client payments. Tessa leaned over my shoulder, studying the incoming wire. And she made sure your father never found out about it. Your dad is notoriously strict about lending money to family without a formal contract. Suddenly, my mother's absolute, unquestioning loyalty on the night of my eviction made terrifying sense. Diane had not just been blinded by her intense favoritism for her golden child. She was acting out of sheer, unadulterated self-preservation. When Amelia started screaming about a divorce and a ruined marriage, my mother was not just looking at a broken home. She was looking at the very real possibility that her secret $75,000 loan would be exposed in a messy financial discovery process. If Paul found out she had hidden that kind of financial liability from him, his wrath would have been catastrophic. Diane protected Amelia because exposing Amelia meant exposing herself. My mother had actively chosen to sacrifice her youngest daughter to protect her own financial secrets. The betrayal cut deeper than anything I had experienced so far. It was not just a lack of love. It was a calculated, transactional sacrifice. Before I could fully process the gravity of my mother's complicity, Tessa's phone chimed with a rapid succession of text messages. It was Ivy. Tessa read the screen, her dark eyebrows knitting together. Ivy just remembered a massive blowout at the staging studio about 3 weeks ago. Amelia completely lost her mind and nearly fired a junior assistant over a reservation glitch. An automated confirmation email for a luxury furniture rental was accidentally sent to the wrong vendor profile in their booking system. Ivy said Amelia locked herself in her office for 3 hours, frantically trying to figure out if the system had an auto-forwarding rule enabled. The final, fatal piece of the puzzle slid into place, locking the entire mechanism together with a resounding click. I stood up from my desk, my pulse hammering in my ears as I paced the narrow length of the office. Amelia was not just buying furniture, she was buying property with Nolan Reeves. They were using the embezzled funds and my mother's secret loan to purchase a hidden asset. To do that, they needed to utilize a secure property management portal, and the portal for the Marlowe Residence Club was notoriously unforgiving. If Amelia had registered as a co-buyer or a long-term leaseholder at Marlowe, the system would require a secondary administrative contact for emergency overrides and closing packet deliveries. In her frantic rush to keep the transaction hidden from Grant, she must have bypassed creating a new, verifiable contact. Instead, she likely dug through her company's old vendor histories and resurrected the dormant profile from the urban renewal fair 14 months prior. She reactivated the exact profile I had built. She thought she was being clever by using an existing corporate pathway that bypassed initial security screenings. She completely forgot that the secondary notification email permanently hardwired into that specific profile belonged to me. If she used that old profile, I said, my voice tight and breathless, then the Marlowe system is programmed to carbon copy every single major administrative milestone to the secondary address. I am talking about the deposit confirmations, the parking garage assignments, the final closing documents, and if the system sent those notifications to your Lakeview Corridor work email, Tessa finished, her eyes widening as she caught up to my train of thought. Then the proof of her affair, her embezzlement, and her secret property is sitting on a server somewhere right now. I rushed back to my computer, my fingers flying across the keyboard as I desperately opened my archived email folders. I searched for the Marlowe domain. I searched for Nolan Reeves. I searched for Amelia's name. Nothing. The inbox was entirely empty of anything matching those parameters. I sank back into my chair, a wave of profound frustration crashing over me. The theory was absolutely flawless. The timeline, the motives, the financial trails, the panic over the misdirected email all aligned perfectly. I had successfully mapped the entire anatomy of the murder, but I still did not possess the body. Right now, everything Tessa, Grant, and I had compiled was entirely circumstantial. It was a terrifying, chilling web of assumptions and indirect evidence. If I marched into my parents' pristine suburban home right now and presented them with society photographs and a confusing narrative about server profiles, Amelia would easily spin it. She would cry. She would claim Grant and I were colluding to destroy her, and my parents would eagerly swallow the lie to maintain their comfortable delusion. I did not just need a theory. I needed the smoking gun. I needed a piece of evidence so absolute, so bureaucratically undeniable, that neither my sister's tears nor my mother's financial terror could possibly explain it away. I needed the hard paperwork, and until I found a way to force the Marlowe system to surrender its secrets, the family that had thrown me into the street would continue to sleep peacefully, completely unaware of the storm gathering just outside their door. We spent the next 48 hours chasing phantoms down dead-end alleys. The initial adrenaline rush of discovering the missing money and the potential property link rapidly faded into a grueling, demoralizing slog. We had the motive, but building a concrete chain of custody from a series of scattered behavioral anomalies was proving nearly impossible without a subpoena. Tessa heard a rumor from one of Ivy's former co-workers that Amelia had allegedly purchased a prepaid, untraceable cell phone to manage her communications with Nolan. We spent an entire Saturday afternoon huddled over my cramped folding table, meticulously cross-referencing Grant's shared cellular billing statements. We looked for strange data spikes, recurring short-duration calls to unlisted numbers, or unusual ping locations. My eyes burned from staring at rows of tiny black text, but we found absolutely nothing actionable. If Amelia had a secondary device, she paid for it in cash and never connected it to the marital wireless network. The rumor remained just that, a whisper we could never drag into a courtroom or a family living room. Desperate for traction, we pivoted our focus to a supposed wellness retreat Amelia claimed she attended in late August. She had told Grant and our mother that she was spending 5 days at a highly exclusive, all-women's spa in Sedona to decompress from the stress of the staging business. Tessa, utilizing her paralegal ruthlessness, spoofed her caller identification and phoned the resort's front desk. She claimed to be an executive assistant needing to forward an urgent floral delivery to Amelia Price. The concierge politely informed her that they had no record of a guest by that name checking in during that specific week. It was highly suspicious, but it was still a circumstantial void. A clever manipulator like my sister could easily excuse it away. She could claim she stayed under a friend's name for privacy, or that she had a last-minute panic attack and stayed at a local hotel just to be alone. A missing hotel reservation was not a smoking gun. It was merely a missing hotel reservation. By late Tuesday night, the biting chill of the South St. Louis studio had seeped entirely into my bones. The baseboard heater clanked uselessly against the wall. I sat on the edge of my thin mattress, staring at the chaotic web of sticky notes and printed spreadsheets taped to the peeling plaster. A crushing wave of exhaustion crashed over me, bringing with it a dark, insidious tide of self-doubt. "Maybe I am losing my mind," I whispered, pressing the heels of my hands into my burning eyes. "Maybe I am taking a handful of random marital problems and aggressively forcing them into a conspiracy just because I want to punish her. Maybe she just had a breakdown, and I am desperately trying to invent a criminal mastermind to make myself feel less pathetic about being thrown out like garbage." Tessa, who was aggressively tearing into a stale bagel by the kitchen sink, stopped chewing. She walked over, pulled the desk chair backward, and straddled it, resting her arms over the wooden backrest. She fixed me with a gaze so intense it practically pinned me to the wall. "Do not do that," Tessa ordered, her voice completely devoid of sympathy and full of absolute steel. "Do not let her gaslight you from across the city. You are not inventing anything. The money is gone. The mother funded her. The developer was hovering. Right now, she feels untouchable, But you need to remember one fundamental rule about professional liars. A liar always looks invincible, towering, and utterly powerful right up until the exact second the victim holds the paperwork. The illusion of her power relies entirely on your lack of documentation. She was right. I was letting the emotional trauma of my family's betrayal cloud my operational judgment. I took a deep, shuddering breath, deliberately visualizing a heavy steel box. I took all my grief, all the sting of my father's final words, and all my frustration, and I locked them inside that mental box. I was a compliance analyst. It was time to stop acting like a wounded sister and start acting like an auditor hunting a critical vulnerability. I turned back to my dual monitors. If the automated notification regarding the Marlowe property had not landed in my active Lakeview Corridor inbox, I needed to figure out exactly why. I logged directly into the municipal legacy servers, bypassing the standard user interface to access the raw architectural framework of the urban renewal event from over a year ago. I did not look for emails. I looked at the routing mechanics. It took me 3 hours of digging through archived directories, but I finally located the precise secondary contact profile I had built for the event. I opened the permission logs and studied the digital architecture. The profile itself was nothing more than an empty shell. It did not contain deep private records or native financial data. It functioned merely as a digital tripwire. Its sole purpose was to act as a carbon copy destination for any external vendor modifying a master schedule attached to the Marlowe property node. If Amelia had reused this dormant profile to fast-track a property registration, she inadvertently attached my tripwire to her new, highly classified transaction. However, the Marlowe internal server did not handle the sensitive financial transfers. It only handled building logistics. I pulled up the original vendor manifest from the renewal fair. The missing link stared right back at me. The entity responsible for processing all deposits, deeds, and escrow accounts for the Marlowe Residence Club was an independent, highly regulated financial institution called Rivermark Title and Escrow. If Amelia triggered a closing packet, Marlowe would not send it. Rivermark would. And if Rivermark's automated system attempted to carbon copy my legacy email address, it might have been flagged by their internal security algorithms as a mismatched domain, placing the notification into a temporary quarantine hold rather than bouncing it entirely. The system was likely sitting in a state of administrative limbo, waiting for a manual verification. I did not need to hack anything. I just needed to politely ask the system to clear its throat. I opened a new, blank message from my official Lakeview Corridor work email. I spent 20 minutes crafting a message that was aggressively mundane, stripping away every ounce of desperation or personal interest. It had to sound like a thoroughly bored municipal employee performing a routine system cleanse. I addressed it to the primary compliance division at Rivermark Title and Escrow. "To whom it may concern," I typed, my keystrokes loud and methodical in the quiet room. "I am a compliance analyst operating with the Lakeview Corridor Renewal Office. During a routine internal audit of our legacy vendor profiles, it has come to my attention that my professional email address may remain incorrectly tethered as a secondary administrative contact to an active client node within your automated distribution system, specifically regarding properties at the Marlowe Residence Club. Please verify if any recent closing packets, deposit receipts, or automated status notifications have been misdirected to this address, as it represents a potential data privacy liability for your institution. I request an immediate correction of the copied recipient fields and an updated packet log to verify the removal." It was a bluff wrapped in dense bureaucratic armor. By citing a potential data privacy liability, I was forcing their compliance team to investigate the routing error immediately to avoid a regulatory infraction. I stared at the blinking cursor for a long moment. It felt like such a small, fragile stone to throw at the massive, seemingly impenetrable fortress Amelia had built around her lies. My hand hovered over the mouse. I did not dare to harbor any real hope that this single clinical action would yield the catastrophic proof I needed. I was fully prepared for a generic automated rejection response. I took one final breath, clicked the send button, and watched the message vanish into the digital ether. I had no way of knowing it then, but that quiet, coldly professional choice was the exact moment the lock broke. That singular, unemotional inquiry was about to become the wide-open door through which my sister's entire hidden life would finally step out into the blinding light. The following afternoon, the fluorescent lights of the Lakeview Corridor Renewal Office hummed their familiar, monotonous tune. It was 3:15, and the air in the room felt stagnant, heavy with the scent of ozone from the copy machine down the hall. I was midway through a tedious review of a municipal zoning permit, my eyes tracing over the standard contractual clauses, when my cell phone vibrated violently against the cheap veneer of my desk. The screen illuminated, displaying a single new email notification. I did not gasp. My heart did not skip a beat. Instead, a strange, profound stillness washed over my entire body. I picked up the device, my thumb hovering over the glass, and unlocked the screen. The sender was listed as the Automated Compliance Division of Rivermark Title and Escrow. The subject line was chilling in its brevity, entirely devoid of any human emotion or recognition of the devastation it carried. It read simply, "Correction of copied notification recipient. Updated closing packet." I clicked open the message. The body text consisted of 3 highly sanitized, legally mandated paragraphs. A junior compliance officer had drafted a formal apology, stating that my professional contact information had been inadvertently retained within an archived secondary profile tethered to the Marlowe Residence Club master registry. The representative explained that a system error had temporarily quarantined a batch of automated administrative alerts, and upon manual review of the bounce-back logs, they were officially releasing the intercepted documents to me before purging my address from the active client node. Attached at the bottom of the email was a single PDF file. It was a 14-page digital scan. I clicked the attachment. The file loaded instantly, filling my monitor with the stark, black-and-white reality of a standardized real estate contract. There was no sweeping cinematic score. There was no dramatic confrontation. The absolute destruction of my sister's perfect lie arrived in 12-point Arial font, neatly aligned within the rigid borders of a legal form. I scrolled past the cover letter and the standard indemnity clauses, landing squarely on the primary declaration of ownership. The property was listed as a luxury condominium unit within the Marlowe Residence Club, an address that commanded a premium well beyond the scope of a standard staging business. Below the address, the fields for the designated buyers were fully populated. 2 names sat side by side, permanently bound together in ink under the designation of joint tenants with right of survivorship: Amelia Bennett Price and Nolan Reeves. I stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in my eyes. It was no longer a whispered rumor circulating through a dark cocktail lounge. It was no longer an assumption based on lingering glances or hushed conversations in a break room. It was an immovable, legally binding fact. My sister and her married lover had not just engaged in a fleeting affair, they had purchased a fortress together. My hand was completely steady as I scrolled down to the 3rd page, which detailed the financial mechanics of the transaction. The escrow deposit ledger outlined the exact structure of their earnest money. The total down payment required for the closing was listed at $225,000. The document broke down the origin of those funds with devastating clarity. The first incoming wire transfer was logged as exactly $150,000. The routing number attached to that specific transfer matched the marital investment account she shared with Grant. Beside it sat the second wire transfer, perfectly plugging the remaining gap in the deposit. It was logged as exactly $75,000. The originating entity was listed as the Private Wealth Management Trust belonging to our mother. Every single discrepancy, every missing dollar, every terrified lie Amelia had spun over the past few months suddenly possessed a verifiable barcode. She had drained her own marriage and manipulated our mother to buy a secret life with another woman's husband. I continued scrolling, moving past the parking garage assignments and the security gate access codes, until I reached the very end of the document. The final 2 pages consisted of the digital signature audit log. In the world of compliance, The audit log is the ultimate truth teller. It records the exact moment a party applies their electronic signature, capturing the timestamp and the verified device history. I checked the dates listed beside Amelia's signature blocks. She had executed the primary closing documents, the title transfers, and the final financial disclosures over a 3-day period beginning on the 26th of August. That was the exact window of time she had supposedly spent at an exclusive, all-women wellness retreat in Sedona. While Grant was sitting in their sprawling suburban home, believing his wife was meditating and recovering from the stress of her business, Amelia was actually sitting in front of a computer screen, finalizing the purchase of a hidden estate with her lover. She was legally intertwining her stolen assets with Nolan Reeves while texting her husband photos of fake desert landscapes she had undoubtedly downloaded from the internet. I sat back in my desk chair. The office around me was entirely silent, save for the low hum of the ventilation system. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel the sudden urge to scream, nor did I feel the hot, blinding rush of vindictive rage. The emotional hurricane that had battered me since the night of my eviction was instantly replaced by a deep, Arctic cold. Looking at the indisputable proof of her financial and moral bankruptcy, the true architecture of her betrayal finally became visible to me. I finally understood the terrifying depth of her sociopathy. Amelia had not blamed me for her divorce, simply because she needed a temporary distraction. She had not thrown me onto the lawn just to save her social reputation or to play the victim in front of our parents. She had orchestrated my destruction because she knew this exact document existed. She knew that, eventually, the money would be audited. She knew the misdirected emails or the property taxes would eventually surface. She needed to preemptively obliterate my credibility so entirely that when this exact paperwork finally emerged, no one in the family would ever believe it. By framing me as a jealous, home-wrecking sister, she had built a massive emotional firewall. She ensured that if I ever tried to present this evidence, my parents would dismiss it as a malicious forgery created by a bitter sibling. She had burned me alive to protect a real estate transaction. I reached out and placed my hand flat against the surface of the desk, grounding myself in the physical reality of the room. The paper trail was complete. I finally had the evidence I needed. I highlighted the entire 14-page document, downloaded it, and saved it to my encrypted local drive. The time for speculation was over. Now it was time to confront her with the truth. I could have clicked a single button. I could have attached the 14-page digital file to a mass message, sent it to my parents and my brother-in-law, and watched the fallout from the quiet safety of my office. It would have been the easiest route. But the easiest route would not give me the one thing I needed more than vindication. I needed to look my sister in the eye the exact second her fabricated reality collapsed. I needed to see her raw, unfiltered reaction before she had the luxury of time to construct a new lie. I printed the document on heavy office paper, slid it into a plain manila envelope, and drove 45 minutes across the city to the upscale leased townhouse Amelia was currently occupying. When she opened the heavy oak door, she looked exactly as she always did. She wore a pristine cream-colored cashmere sweater, her hair perfectly styled, holding a crystal glass of sparkling water. She was the portrait of the tragic, elegant woman bravely navigating a sudden divorce. Her polite, weary expression instantly dissolved the moment she saw me standing on her welcome mat. I did not say a word. I simply raised my phone, the screen brightly illuminated, displaying the exact subject line of the email from the title and escrow company. All the color drained from Amelia's face. Her flawless complexion turned the color of old parchment. I stepped forward, forcing her to step back into the foyer, and I walked right past her into the impeccably decorated living room. I did not scream. I did not raise my voice or throw my hands into the air. The blinding rage I thought I would feel was entirely absent, replaced by a clinical, terrifying calm. I stood in the center of her expensive wool rug and turned to face her. "I just have one question," I said, my voice completely flat, devoid of any sisterly warmth or lingering grief. "Why did you have to build a narrative that I destroyed your marriage?" Amelia immediately deployed the first, most predictable layer of psychological manipulation. She chose outright denial. "I have absolutely no idea what you are talking about," she scoffed, recovering her posture and crossing her arms defensively over her chest. "You are delusional, Natalie. You are standing in my home, making insane accusations because you are still bitter about Dad throwing you out. You need to leave right now before I call the police." I did not move a single muscle. I just stared at her. Sensing that the denial was useless against my absolute silence, she rapidly shifted to the second layer. She chose righteous anger. "How dare you come here?" Amelia's voice rose to a shrill, vibrating pitch. She pointed a manicured finger toward the front door. "After the hell you put me through, after you manipulated Grant and tried to ruin my life, you are sick. You have always been sick and obsessed with me." I let her shout. I let the echoes of her feigned outrage bounce off the high ceilings. When she finally paused to take a breath, I reached into the manila envelope. I pulled out the printed property records and dropped them onto the glass surface of her coffee table. The thick stack of paper landed with a heavy, definitive thud. "That is the deed to the condominium at the Marlowe Residence Club," I stated, watching her eyes track the movement of my hand. "It includes the digital signature logs, the financial routing numbers, and the joint tenancy agreement. Nolan Reeves is listed right next to your name." Amelia looked down at the documents. For the first time in my entire life, I watched the great, untouchable socialite completely lose control of her script. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the living room. She did not reach for the paper. She did not try to rip it up. She just stared at the bold, black ink as if it were a venomous snake coiled on her table. The silence stretched for 10 seconds, then 20 seconds. I watched the gears in her mind violently grinding, desperately searching for a way to spin the unspinnable. Finding none, she immediately dropped into the third and final layer of defense. She became the victim of a massive, privacy-invading conspiracy. "You hacked my accounts," Amelia whispered, taking a shaky step backward, her eyes wide with manufactured terror. "You are stalking me. You illegally accessed my private financial data. I am going to have you arrested. Natalie, I will ruin your entire career for this." "It was an automated administrative bounce back," I replied smoothly, cutting through her panic with absolute precision. "You used my old vendor profile to bypass the security screening. The system sent the closing packet directly to my government inbox. It is completely legal, entirely verifiable, and completely out of your control." The threat of police action vanished from her lips. The realization that she had authored her own destruction finally settled over her. Her shoulders slumped, the rigid, perfect posture collapsing under the weight of the undeniable truth. "Grant was already suspicious," Amelia blurted out, her voice cracking. It was the closest thing to an honest statement she had made in months. She wrapped her arms around her own waist, looking frantic and cornered. "He was asking about the equity line. He was checking the browser history. I was running out of time. I needed to secure the property before he locked down the accounts, and I did not have many choices." "You had thousands of choices," I countered, my tone dropping to a sharp whisper. "You could have just asked for a divorce. You could have run away with Nolan. You could have lied about a bad business investment, but you did not do any of those things. You actively chose to frame me. You sat on the lawn and watched Dad throw my belongings into the dirt. So I am asking you again, why me?" Amelia looked up at me. Her eyes were red, but there was a calculating hardness behind them. She had been pushed entirely into the corner, stripped of her elegant facades and her convenient lies, stripped down to her core. She finally showed me the absolute ugliness of her true nature. "Because you were believable as the jealous one," Amelia said. The words hung in the air, sharp and toxic. She said it with a chilling, pragmatic honesty. "Mom and Dad already thought you were unhappy with your life," she continued, her voice gaining a sickening sort of confidence. "You never married. You have that boring desk job. You live in that tiny apartment. They were already primed to believe you resented me. If I blamed a coworker, Grant would have investigated. If I blamed a friend, they would have demanded proof. But if I blamed you, I knew Mom and Dad would just accept it. They wanted an excuse to protect me, and you were the easiest target. The sheer mechanics of her cruelty were breathtaking. She had weaponized my quiet nature and my parents' inherent favoritism to build a human shield. So you took the money, I said, summarizing the wreckage. You bought a secret life with a married man, and you let Mom fund it, Amelia scoffed, shaking her head as if I were a child failing to grasp a basic concept. Mom knew I needed the money to protect myself. I told her Grant was planning to freeze my assets. I told her I was entering a private property agreement to ensure I had a place to live if things went bad. She gave me the loan willingly. I paused, my analytical mind instantly catching the slight discrepancy in her phrasing. A private property agreement? Yes, Amelia snapped impatiently. She knew I was securing a condominium. She just wanted to keep it quiet so Dad would not interrogate her about the transferred funds. I let out a low, humorless breath. A massive new fracture had just appeared in the family dynamic. Diane Bennett, our mother who claimed to value honesty and morality above all else, had actively conspired to help her eldest daughter hide assets from a spouse. She had knowingly funded what she believed was a secret solo escape plan, but based on Amelia's careful wording, I realized something far more explosive. She does not know about Nolan, I said softly, the realization locking into place. Mom knows about the loan, and she knows about the property, but you never told her you were buying it with another woman's husband. She thinks she was protecting an abused wife. She does not know she funded an illicit affair. Amelia's jaw clamped shut. The brief flash of panic in her eyes confirmed my theory entirely. I had everything I needed. The puzzle was complete, and the picture it formed was utterly grotesque. Amelia was a parasite who had manipulated every single person in her orbit. She had betrayed her husband, lied to her mother, and completely sacrificed her sister, all to serve her own selfish desires. I turned away from her and began walking toward the front door. "Where are you going?" Amelia demanded, her voice rising in a fresh wave of panic. "Natalie, you cannot send that document. If Grant sees that, he will take everything in the divorce. Nolan will lose his company. You will destroy my entire life." I stopped with my hand on the brass doorknob. I looked back at the woman who had shared my childhood, the woman who had watched me get thrown onto the street and felt nothing but relief. Proving my innocence was no longer the objective. My innocence was a proven, undeniable fact sitting on her glass table. The issue now was absolute power. I held a truth that could tear the entire family infrastructure apart. I could destroy Amelia's divorce settlement. I could expose my mother's financial betrayal to my father. I could ruin a prominent real estate developer. "I am not going to destroy your life, Amelia," I said quietly, opening the heavy door to the cool evening air. "You already did that all by yourself. I am just deciding who gets to read the obituary." I stepped out of the townhouse, pulling the door firmly shut behind me, leaving her alone with the paperwork and the terrifying silence of her impending ruin. Tess and I spent the entire evening transforming a catastrophic family betrayal into a flawless corporate dossier. We cleared the cheap folding table in my freezing apartment and laid out the printed documents one by one. We did not cry, we did not scream, and we did not allow a single ounce of emotional grief to taint the process. We built a timeline so clean and devastatingly chronological that it left absolutely no room for interpretation or debate. First, we placed the date of Amelia making her hysterical accusation on the front lawn. Second, we documented the exact week Grant had begun questioning the massive withdrawals from their joint equity line. Third, we logged the incoming wire transfer proving my mother had secretly funded Amelia's hidden accounts. Fourth, we positioned the property deed for the luxury condominium at the Marlowe Residence Club, clearly showing Amelia and Nolan Reeves as joint tenants. Finally, we attached the electronic signature audit logs, undeniably proving that my sister had finalized a massive real estate purchase with her married lover during the exact window of time she claimed to be recovering at an exclusive wellness retreat. The entire narrative of my supposed jealousy and marital sabotage was reduced to a desperate, poorly constructed smokescreen designed to hide financial crimes and infidelity. I opened my laptop and drafted a single email. I placed Diane, Paul, Grant, and Amelia in the recipient line. I deliberately chose a subject line that sounded more like a pending litigation notice than a family correspondence. Clarification of marital interference allegations and associated asset documentation. In the body of the email, I refused to use a single insult. I did not call my sister a liar, a thief, or a sociopath. The facts were violent enough on their own. Adding emotional adjectives would only give them a way to accuse me of being unhinged. I wrote exactly 3 crisp sentences. I stated that I had been falsely accused of orchestrating a divorce. I stated that the attached 14-page document outlined the actual financial timeline and the true motive behind my sudden expulsion from the family. I concluded by saying I would no longer entertain any further accusations regarding a marriage I never touched. I attached the PDF file. I took a slow, deep breath, staring at the screen for a fraction of a second, and then I clicked send. For exactly 4 minutes, the studio apartment was completely silent. The only sound was the faint rattling of the water pipes behind the plaster wall. Then, my phone lit up, the screen lit up, vibrating violently across the wooden table as a relentless barrage of notifications poured in. Amelia called me 5 times in rapid succession, followed immediately by a flood of frantic text messages begging me not to forward the document to Nolan's wife or the staging company board of directors. My mother left a voicemail composed entirely of hyperventilating sobs and chaotic apologies, but it was the text message from my father that truly made my blood run cold. He sent a single line. "Do not send this to anyone else. We need to keep this in the house. Keep it in the house." I stared at those words until the letters blurred together, a wave of profound, sickening disgust washing over me. On the night they decided I was guilty, there was absolutely no desire to keep anything in the house. They had thrown my heavy suitcase and my boxes of books onto the damp front lawn under the bright glare of the streetlights. They had publicly stripped me of my dignity in the open air, allowing every neighbor on the block to witness my humiliation. But now that the golden child was exposed as a fraud, and the truth threatened to shatter their perfect suburban image, suddenly privacy was their most sacred family value. The following morning, the receptionist at the Lakeview Corridor Renewal Office called my desk to inform me that I had an unannounced visitor waiting in the lobby. I knew exactly who it was before I even stepped onto the elevator. When the metal doors slid open on the ground floor, I found my mother sitting on a modern leather sofa. She looked terrible. Her usually flawless hair was slightly disheveled, and she was clutching her expensive designer handbag against her chest like a life preserver. I walked over and sat down in the armchair directly across from her. I waited for the full, devastating apology. I waited for the woman who gave birth to me to fall apart, to tell me she was heartbroken that she had blindly trusted a lie, to beg for my forgiveness for abandoning me. Instead, Diane leaned forward, her eyes darting nervously around the empty glass lobby to ensure no one was listening. "Natalie, please," my mother whispered, her voice trembling with a frantic, selfish energy. "You have proved your point. Grant is furious, and Amelia is having a complete breakdown. But you have to go easy on her. If you let this spread, she will lose her entire business reputation. Nolan will drop her. She will have absolutely nothing left." I stared at her, my face completely impassive. She bought a house with stolen money and another woman's husband. Mom, I did not do that to her. She did it to herself. Diane swallowed hard, her knuckles turning white as she gripped her bag tighter. "I know she made a terrible mistake, but you do not understand what this will do to me. If your father sees those bank routing numbers, if he realizes I gave her that massive loan without telling him, he will freeze my accounts. He will never trust me again. You cannot let him see the financial pages. Natalie, please." Sitting in that sterile, brightly lit lobby, a massive paradigm shift occurred inside my mind. The last lingering shred of hope that my family was simply misguided completely evaporated. My mother had not come to my workplace to seek justice for the daughter she had wronged. She had come to negotiate a plea deal for the daughter who had lied, and more importantly, for herself. Diane Bennett had not just been a passive victim of Amelia's manipulation. She was a willing participant in the architecture of the cover-up. She had actively chosen the peace and comfort of a convenient lie over the brutal justice owed to her youngest daughter. She was terrified of losing her financial autonomy and her social standing, and she was perfectly willing to let me remain the villain if it meant keeping her secrets buried. "The email is already in Dad's inbox," I said softly, my voice devoid of any warmth. "I am not redacting a single page to save you from your own choices. You bought her lie. Mom. Now you have to pay the mortgage on it." I stood up and walked away, leaving her weeping silently on the leather sofa. Later that afternoon, a final message arrived from my father. He demanded a family meeting at their house at 7 o'clock that evening. His tone was stiff and commanding, still desperately trying to maintain the illusion of the powerful patriarch managing a minor internal crisis. He wrote that we would handle the situation internally, as a family, and figure out a path forward. I looked at the text message for a long time. I had zero intention of ever moving back into my childhood bedroom. I had zero intention of forgiving them, and I certainly had no desire to help them salvage their ruined reputation, but I accepted the invitation anyway. I agreed to go back to the pristine suburban house, not because I wanted to return to the fold, but because I needed to hear the absolute truth spoken aloud in the exact same physical space where they had thrown me out. I needed them to choke on their own reality under the very porch light where they had condemned me. The power dynamic had completely inverted, and I was going to walk through their front door one last time, solely to watch the empire fall. I parked my 10-year-old sedan along the familiar curb precisely at 7 o'clock in the evening. The autumn air was sharp, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke, but I felt absolutely nothing as I walked up the concrete steps. This was the exact spot where my belongings had been violently thrown into the dirt just a few weeks prior. But tonight, I carried nothing but a thin manila envelope. The heavy oak door was unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped into the living room. The atmosphere was completely devoid of familial warmth. It felt remarkably like a high-stakes corporate deposition. My father, Paul, sat rigidly in his oversized leather recliner, his posture aggressively upright as he desperately attempted to maintain his waning authority. My mother, Diane, perched on the edge of the floral sofa, her eyes entirely bloodshot, nervously twisting a damp tissue between her fingers. Amelia sat perfectly upright in a wingback chair. Her face was a pale, chalky mask, but her eyes still darted around the room, frantically calculating a way to regain control of the crumbling narrative. My father cleared his throat, adjusting his stiff collar. "Well," he began, his voice laced with a forced, diplomatic calm, "I am glad you decided to come over. It seems you have managed to clear up this unfortunate situation. We can all sit down and figure out how to put this misunderstanding behind us." The word misunderstanding hit my ears like a physical blow. They were still trying to sanitize their cruelty. They wanted to wrap the severe trauma they inflicted on me in soft, corporate language to avoid looking at the ugliness of their own actions. I did not sit down. I remained standing in the center of the plush rug, towering over them. I opened the manila envelope and pulled out the printed pages. I refused to let their manufactured emotion bleed into the room before the hard evidence did. I placed the first sheet of paper squarely on the glass coffee table. "This was not a misunderstanding," I stated, my voice echoing coldly off the high ceiling. I placed the second sheet down. "This is the timeline of a systematic fraud." I pointed to the dates, forcing them to look at the undeniable chronology. "Here is the exact day you accused me of ruining your marriage. Here is the bank statement showing when the money vanished from your marital accounts. And here is the deed to the luxury condominium, co-owned by you and a married developer, signed during the exact week you claimed to be on a wellness retreat." Before Amelia could open her mouth to launch into another fabricated defense, the heavy front door opened again. It was exactly 7:30. Grant walked into the living room, wearing a dark suit. his face entirely composed but radiating a terrifying absolute finality. He did not even glance at his wife. He walked directly to the coffee table and dropped a thick legal binder next to my printed pages. "My attorneys finished their forensic financial review this afternoon," Grant announced, his voice devoid of any affection. "Every single dollar that left our joint accounts has been traced directly into the escrow holding for the Marlowe Residence Club property. The money is gone. Paul. She stole it to buy a house with Nolan Reeves." My father stared at the papers, the rigid mask of the patriarch finally fracturing into a million pieces. His eyes scanned the financial routing numbers, stopping abruptly on the second incoming wire transfer. The color rapidly drained from his face as he recognized the originating trust account. He turned slowly toward my mother. The silence in the room became so heavy it was difficult to breathe. "Diane," my father said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, vibrating whisper. "Did you give her $75,000 without telling me?" My mother completely crumbled. The pristine, supportive facade she had maintained for decades shattered. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. She confessed everything between ragged sobs. She admitted she had secretly transferred the funds because Amelia had come to her in a panic, claiming she needed an emergency safety net. But the most devastating part of her confession was her reason for staying quiet on the night of my eviction. She looked at my father, terrified. She admitted she let me take the blame because she knew if the financial investigation continued, he would discover she had hidden a massive financial liability from him. She chose to throw me to the wolves solely to protect her own comfortable, wealthy existence. Paul sank back into his leather recliner, staring blankly at the far wall. The absolute magnitude of his foolishness finally washed over him. He realized he had not just made a terrible parenting mistake, he had been actively weaponized. His own wife and his golden child had used his pride and his temper to execute a flawless cover-up. He had thrown his innocent daughter out into the street to protect a pathetic, cowardly lie. I turned my attention away from my broken parents and locked eyes with my sister. Amelia was trembling, her fingernails digging so hard into the armrests of her chair that her knuckles were white. "I want you to say it," I demanded, my voice cutting sharply through our mother's crying. "I want you to look at Dad, and I want you to look at Grant, and I want you to say the words out loud. Tell them I never touched your marriage. Tell them you threw me out to protect a thief." Amelia glared at me, her eyes brimming with tears. But they were not tears of remorse. They were tears of absolute, bitter defeat. She hated me in that moment, not because I was evil, but because I had finally outsmarted her. "You did not do anything," Amelia screamed, her voice cracking violently. "You never spoke to him. You never hired a lawyer. Are you happy now? I made the whole thing up." "And why did you pick me?" I pressed, refusing to let her look away. "Because you always take it," she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "You are the quiet one. You never fight back. I knew if I blamed you, Mom and Dad would just believe it, and you would eventually just swallow the humiliation and come crawling back to the family like you always do. You were supposed to just take it." The ugly, unvarnished truth hung in the air, a toxic cloud that poisoned every single memory I had of this house. My father slowly stood up. He looked incredibly old, suddenly stripped of all his arrogant certainty. He took a hesitant step toward me, raising his hand in a weak gesture of reconciliation. "Natalie," Paul said, his voice cracking with a desperate, pathetic need to fix the unfixable. "We were wrong. We were completely blind. But you are still my daughter. You will always have a place in this house. We can rebuild this." The entire room fell dead silent, waiting for my response. They were waiting for the quiet, compliant younger sister to accept the hollow apology, to clean up the mess, and to restore the family equilibrium. I looked at the man who had told me I no longer belonged to his family. I looked at the mother who had sold me out for a bank account, and the sister who had used me as a human shield. "No," I said, my voice perfectly steady, holding no anger, only absolute finality. That place vanished the exact second you decided a convenient lie was more valuable than the truth. You do not want me back because you love me. You want me back because you are terrified of the consequences of what you have done, and I refuse to be your collateral damage ever again. I turned my back on them and walked out of the living room. I did not look over my shoulder as I crossed the wide foyer. I opened the heavy oak door and stepped out into the crisp, cold night. I left that house for the second and final time, but the terrified, heartbroken girl who had dragged a broken suitcase through the dirt no longer existed. I walked down the concrete steps holding the absolute truth in my hands. That single, automated email from the title company had indeed changed everything. It had not created a perfect, magical justice, nor had it miraculously healed the deep wounds inflicted by my own blood. But it had done something far more important. It had permanently severed their right to rewrite my story. They could no longer dictate my worth or assign me the role of the villain. The power was finally, irrevocably mine. Thank you so much for listening to my story until the very end. I would love to know where you are listening from, so please drop a comment below so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Violet Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people.